His hand hovered over his weapon. Her heart pounded in her chest. But Judge Monica Carter showed no fear as she extended her palm toward the officer. "Your badge, Officer Kincaid. Now." The red and blue lights flashed across her face, casting eerie shadows on the empty road. The officer's fingers trembled, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You can't." "I can and I will." Her voice cut through the night like a blade. "As a Federal Oversight Committee member, I am relieving you of duty effective immediately." For a moment, the only sound was the distant crickets and the soft hum of the patrol car's engine. Then, the crunch of tires on asphalt. Another police vehicle approaching, headlights growing brighter. In that moment, both knew someone might not walk away from this encounter. Officer Kincaid's hand twitched closer to his holster. Picture this: a respected federal judge in her judicial robes facing down a police officer with a history of racial profiling. A confrontation born not from chance, but from a system that's been broken for generations. What Officer Kincaid didn't know was that he had just picked the wrong black woman on the wrong night. Let me take you back to earlier that same day. Judge Monica Carter, 45 years old, widow, mother of 2 college students, stood before her bathroom mirror, straightening the collar of her crisp white blouse. Her elegant fingers worked methodically, her movements precise and deliberate, just like her courtroom decisions. Her eyes, tired but determined, reflected 20 years of fighting battles that never should have existed. 20 years of being the only black woman in rooms full of white men. 20 years of proving herself over and over again. She tucked a strand of silver-streaked hair behind her ear. The grey had come early, around her late 30s. In a profession that often demanded black women look younger, more approachable, she refused to dye it. The silver was her battle scar, earned through sleepless nights and landmark decisions. "Looking distinguished, Mum," her daughter's voice chimed from the tablet propped against the mirror. Monica smiled at the video call. "How's the internship going, Zora?" "Good, though I'm still the only black girl in the program." Zora sighed, her Harvard dorm room visible in the background. Some things change slower than others. Monica applied a subtle shade of lipstick. "Remember what I always tell you?" They finished the phrase together. "Take up space. Make them remember your name." After the call, Monica moved through her morning with practiced efficiency. The house felt empty without her children, but their achievements filled her with fierce pride. Both at top universities, both determined to create change in their own ways. She grabbed her travel mug, her briefcase, and headed out the front door of her colonial-style home in Oakwood Heights, an upscale neighborhood where she was one of only 3 black homeowners. The bitter taste of morning coffee mixed with something all too familiar as she walked to her car. Mrs. Peterson from across the street clutched her purse tighter as they passed. A subtle movement, probably unconscious, but Monica noticed. She always noticed. Then there was the security guard at the courthouse parking entrance, who asked to see her ID, despite having worked there for 5 years. The same guard who waved through her white colleagues without a second glance. Small cuts, day after day. But today was not the day to dwell on them. As she settled into her chambers, Monica's mind flashed back to her first year of law school. The memory hit her with surprising clarity. The flash of police lights, the officer's condescending tone. She had been walking back to her dorm after a late-night study session. The campus police car had pulled alongside her. "Where are you heading this time of night?" The officer's flashlight beam had struck her directly in the eyes, temporarily blinding her. "I'm a student here," she'd replied, squinting against the harsh light. "Got an ID to prove that." His tone suggested he already didn't believe her. She'd fumbled for her student card, hands shaking. Even as she'd produced it, he'd gotten out of his car, hand resting casually on his holster. "You know, we've had reports of non-students using the library." The implication had been clear. She didn't belong. That night had changed something in her, sparked a determination that would shape her career. No one should feel like they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy. Monica pushed the memory away and focused on the files before her. Today's ruling would send shockwaves through the police department. 3 years of investigation into a ring of officers who had systematically falsified evidence and targeted Black and Hispanic neighborhoods for excessive force. Her clerk knocked softly on the door. "The courtroom is ready, Your Honor, but—" He hesitated. "There's been another message." He handed her a printout of an email. No sender name, routed through anonymous servers. "Black robes won't protect you forever." Monica folded the paper and placed it in her desk drawer, along with the others. 5 threats in 3 weeks. She'd reported them, of course, but had refused additional security. Showing fear would only embolden them. "Thank you, Marcus. Let's proceed." The courtroom fell silent as she entered, her robes flowing behind her like a shadow. The weight of what she was about to do settled on her shoulders. Her ruling would not only hold corrupt officers accountable, but would establish new precedent for judicial oversight of police conduct. 12 hours later, it was done. The gavel had fallen. Justice had prevailed, at least on paper. The defendants' faces had been a mixture of shock and rage as she'd announced the formation of a new oversight committee, one she would personally chair. It was close to midnight when Monica finally left the courthouse, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Her security detail had offered to escort her home, but she had dismissed them. A mistake, perhaps, but she needed the solitude, the quiet drive to decompress. Her sleek black Mercedes glided through the empty streets. Her neighborhood, exclusive, gated, supposedly safe, appeared ahead. The streetlights cast pools of gold on the immaculate asphalt. She was almost home, almost able to shed the weight of her robes and the responsibility they carried. Then, the flash of red and blue in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser, lights blazing, signaling her to pull over. Her stomach tightened into a knot. After 20 years in the legal system, she knew that for a Black person, regardless of their status, regardless of their achievements, a traffic stop was never routine. It was a moment fraught with potential danger. She pulled over carefully, positioning her car under a streetlight. Her hands moved to the steering wheel, gripping it at 10 and 2, just as she had taught her son to do if he was ever stopped. The cruiser door opened. A flashlight beam swept over her license plate, then into her car, momentarily blinding her. Heavy footsteps approached, and that was the moment when Judge Monica Carter's evening, and Officer Bradley Kincaid's career, took a turn that would change both their lives forever. The beam of Officer Kincaid's flashlight swept across Monica's face, deliberately lingering in her eyes. She squinted against the harsh glare, but maintained her composure, her hands steady on the steering wheel. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice carrying that unmistakable tone of authority mixed with contempt. Monica had heard it countless times in her courtroom. Officers who viewed themselves as above the law rather than servants of it. She could see him clearly in her side mirror. Officer Bradley Kincaid. White, late 30s, with a square jaw and cold eyes. His right hand rested casually on his holstered weapon, a subtle but clear intimidation tactic. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Her voice remained steady, professional. The same voice that had sentenced murderers and exonerated the innocent. Kincaid's mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Suspicious driving patterns, ma'am." "Suspicious." Monica raised an eyebrow. "I was driving 5 miles under the speed limit in my own neighborhood." He leaned closer to her window, his breath carrying the faint scent of whiskey. "You were weaving, and this vehicle matches a description we have." The lie hung in the air between them. Monica had driven this route hundreds of times. She knew exactly what this was. A Black person in an expensive car in an exclusive neighborhood equals suspicious to officers like Kincaid. What description would that be, officer? She kept her tone neutral, but her heart rate had quickened. This was a dangerous game, and she knew it. Kincaid's eyes narrowed. I need to see your license and registration. Now Monica nodded slowly. I'm going to reach for my purse on the passenger seat to get my wallet. She moved deliberately, the way she'd practiced, the way she'd taught her son to move during their painful but necessary how to survive a police stop conversations when he'd turned 16. From her wallet, she pulled not just her driver's license, but also her judicial identification card. She handed both to Kincaid without comment, watching his face carefully. His eyes flicked down to the ID, then back to her face. For a split second, something like uncertainty flickered across his features. Then his expression hardened. Judge, huh? His tone made the title sound like an accusation rather than an honor. And that's when Monica knew this stop had just become much more dangerous. What most people didn't know about Officer Bradley Kincaid was that behind his decorated record, 2 commendations for bravery, 1 life-saving medal, lurked a history of complaints. 7 in total, all filed by minorities, all mysteriously dismissed during internal reviews. What his fellow officers knew, but never discussed openly, was his rapid decline over the past year. It had started with being passed over for sergeant, a position that went to Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, a black officer with an impeccable record. Then came the divorce, his wife taking the house, and kids to her mother's in Ohio. The drinking had started subtly. A beer after shift became 2, then 3, then vodka in a water bottle during patrol. His anger festered, finding targets in the very communities he was sworn to protect. Tonight, the alcohol humming in his veins, Kincaid made a decision that would end his career. Rather than apologizing or letting Judge Carter go, he doubled down. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am. His hand moved from his holster to rest on his taser. On what grounds? Monica's voice remained calm, but her mind raced through statutes and precedents. This was no longer a simple traffic stop. It was a potential constitutional violation unfolding in real time. Kincaid's jaw tightened. I have reason to believe you may be impaired. Another lie. Another escalation. Officer Kincaid, I have not been drinking. I've been in court until half an hour ago. She met his gaze directly. I'd like you to state clearly for the record why you've pulled me over. That's it. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 347. I'm going to need backup at Oakwood Heights. I have an uncooperative subject. Monica's skin prickled with a cold fear she hadn't felt since she was a young law student. This was no longer just harassment. This was potentially life-threatening. I'll step out, she said carefully, but I want it noted that I'm complying under protest. The car door opened, and Judge Monica Carter emerged, still wearing her judicial robes from the long day in court. The black fabric caught the breeze, billowing slightly around her tall frame. Kincaid's eyes widened momentarily at the sight of the robes, then narrowed again. Hands where I can see them. As she placed her hands clearly in front of her, Monica's mind flashed back to her son's 16th birthday. Instead of just teaching him to drive, she'd had to teach him how to survive being pulled over. Keep your hands visible at all times, she had told him, her voice breaking despite her attempts to stay strong. Announce every movement before you make it. Say yes, sir, even when they don't deserve your respect. Your pride isn't worth your life, Marcus. Her beautiful boy had nodded solemnly, his eyes too old for his young face. Is it always going to be like this, Mom? She hadn't had the heart to tell him the truth. Now, standing on the dark street in her judicial robes, Monica Carter followed her own advice. I'm going to reach into my robe pocket for my phone, Officer Kincaid. Don't you move. His voice had taken on a dangerous edge, his hand now hovering near his weapon again. Officer, I am a federal judge. You've verified my identity. This stop has no legal basis and you know it. Her voice remained steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Kincaid stepped closer, his body language aggressive. Well, Your Honor, out here I'm the law. The sound of another patrol car approaching cut through the tension. Headlights swept across them as a second vehicle pulled up. A younger officer emerged. Latina, early 30s, her movements crisp and professional. Officer Diaz, what's the situation? The newcomer asked, approaching cautiously. Monica noticed something immediately. Officer Diaz's body camera light was blinking, indicating it was active. She glanced at Kincaid's chest. His camera was dark. Officer Diaz, Monica spoke clearly, ensuring her words would be captured by the active camera. I am Judge Monica Carter, Federal District Court. I've been pulled over without cause and am now being detained without explanation. Diaz's eyes widened in recognition. Judge Carter? From the Harrington case? Yes, the very same judge who's been making trouble for the department. Kincaid cut in, his voice thick with resentment. Claims she wasn't driving erratically. Officer Diaz's gaze darted between them, uncertainty clear on her face. She was witnessing something wrong, something potentially career-ending, and Monica could see the young officer calculating her next move. Your body camera is functioning, Officer Diaz? Monica asked pointedly. Yes, Your Honor. It's department policy. Kincaid interrupted. Enough chat. Judge or not, she was driving suspiciously, and I'm conducting a field sobriety test. Without cause, without reading me my rights, and with your body camera conveniently turned off. Monica's voice carried the same authority it did in her courtroom. Officer Diaz, please note for your recording that Officer Kincaid's body camera appears to be disabled. Kincaid's face flushed with anger. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Officer, you are making a serious mistake. Monica stood her ground, dignified even in this humiliating moment. Then, the unthinkable. Kincaid grabbed her arm, spinning her around and reaching for his handcuffs. The metal gleamed in the patrol car's headlights. Officer Kincaid! Even Diaz seemed shocked by this escalation. Sir, maybe we should… I know what I'm doing, Diaz. Kincaid's grip on Monica's arm tightened painfully. In that moment, Judge Monica Carter made a decision. Officer Diaz, I want it on record that I am invoking my authority as chair of the Federal Police Oversight Committee, Northeastern District. Kincaid froze, the handcuffs dangling from his fingers. As of this morning, I have the authority to initiate emergency suspension of officers engaged in civil rights violations. Monica's voice was steady, powerful. Officer Diaz, your superior officer is currently violating my Fourth Amendment rights, and I suspect this is not his first such violation. The tension in the air was electric. Diaz shifted uncomfortably, her hand moving to her own radio. I'm going to reach for my phone now to contact Commissioner Wallace directly, Monica said, slowly moving her hand toward her robe pocket. If you reach for anything, I'll take it as a threat, Kincaid hissed, but his confidence was clearly shaken. Slowly, deliberately, Monica slid her hand into her pocket and pressed the voice recording button. The soft confirmation vibration against her finger provided a small measure of relief. Before she could pull out the phone, Kincaid grabbed her wrist. That's it. You're under arrest for resisting and interfering with police business. Bradley! Officer Diaz's voice held a note of panic. Stop and think about what you're doing. Monica maintained her dignity, even as Kincaid twisted her arm behind her back. She locked eyes with Officer Diaz. You have a choice to make right now, Officer Diaz. The kind that defines a career and a life. What kind of officer do you want to be? What would you do if you were in Judge Carter's position right now? Would you fight back, submit to the injustice, or find another way? Sometimes the most powerful resistance doesn't look like resistance at all. Diaz stepped forward, her hand now resting on her own weapon. Bradley, let her go. Now. For a tense moment, no one moved. The weight of the moment, of history, of justice, of the broken system they all operated within, hung heavy in the night air. Then, cutting through the standoff, came the distinctive sound of tires on asphalt. Bright headlights swept around the corner, illuminating all three figures in harsh white light. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up alongside the patrol cars. No markings, no lights, but exuding the unmistakable aura of authority. Kincaid's grip on Monica's arm slackened as the SUV's doors began to open. The night had just become infinitely more complicated. The SUV doors swung open and three figures emerged. The streetlights revealed Police Commissioner Wallace, flanked by two stern-faced internal affairs officers. Their expressions told the whole story. This was no coincidental arrival. "Officer Kincaid, stand down immediately." The commissioner's voice cut through the night like a thunderclap. Kincaid's face drained of color. His grip on Monica's arm released instantly, leaving angry red marks on her skin. "Commissioner?" His voice cracked, no longer carrying that smugness from minutes before. Wallace approached, his gaze moving from Monica to Kincaid. "Judge Carter, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Commissioner." Monica straightened her robe with dignity. "Though I believe Officer Kincaid was about to make a career-ending mistake." The Commissioner nodded grimly. "I received your emergency alert. We've been tracking Officer Kincaid's patrol route all evening." That's when the realization hit Monica like a physical blow. She studied Kincaid's face more carefully, the pieces clicking together. "Bradley Kincaid. You're not just any officer, are you?" Your name appeared multiple times in the case files. Kincaid's eyes widened, darting between the Commissioner and the internal affairs officers, who were now circling like sharks. Monica continued, her voice gathering strength. "Text messages to Detective Sanderson, bank transfers to Officer Wells, both defendants in the corruption case I just ruled on." Kincaid's hand twitched nervously. "This isn't what it looks like." "This stop wasn't random, was it?" Monica's mind raced through the evidence she'd reviewed for months. "You were sent to intimidate me, or worse." The Commissioner stepped forward. "We've been monitoring a group of officers connected to the corruption ring. Your ruling today stirred the hornet's nest, Judge." Officer Kincaid received 3 calls from known associates right after court adjourned. For a moment, everything went still. Monica could hear her own heartbeat, feel the weight of her mother's voice from decades ago. "When they show you who they are, believe them the first time, but never let them see you bend." She stepped forward, power radiating from her every movement. The frightened woman from minutes ago was gone. In her place stood the full authority of the federal judiciary. "Officer Bradley Kincaid," her voice rang with certainty and command. "Under the authority granted to me as chair of the Federal Police Oversight Committee, I am relieving you of duty effective immediately pending a full investigation." Kincaid's face contorted with rage and fear. "You can't do this." "I can. I am." She extended her open palm. "Your badge, officer. Now." Time seemed to slow. Kincaid's right hand twitched, hovering dangerously near his holster rather than his badge. His pupils dilated, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. In one fluid motion, Officer Diaz drew her weapon, aiming directly at Kincaid. "Don't even think about it, Bradley." Surrounded by the Commissioner, Internal Affairs, and his own partner, Kincaid finally accepted defeat. His shoulders slumped as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. With trembling fingers, he unclipped his badge, the symbol of authority he had abused for so long. For a moment, he clutched it tightly, as if it might save him from what was coming. Then, with a resigned exhale, he placed it in Judge Carter's outstretched palm. Comment below if you've ever witnessed an abuse of power and how it was handled. Did justice prevail, or was the system protected at the expense of truth? The badge felt impossibly heavy in Monica's palm. The metal was warm from Kincaid's body heat, the gold shield catching the flashing blue and red lights. In that small object lay both the promise of protection and the potential for abuse. "This is just the beginning," Kincaid muttered, his voice barely audible as the internal affairs officers moved in, securing his wrists with the very handcuffs he had intended for the judge. The commissioner stepped forward. "Officer Bradley Kincaid, you're under arrest for civil rights violations, abuse of power, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." Monica watched as they read him his rights. Rights she had upheld in her courtroom for decades. Rights now protecting the very man who had tried to violate hers. The irony wasn't lost on her. One of the internal affairs officers approached her. "Judge Carter, we'll need your statement. And with your permission, we'd like to retrieve the recording from your phone." Monica nodded, handing over her phone. "Everything since the moment he approached my vehicle should be there." Meanwhile, other officers were already searching Kincaid's patrol car. One emerged holding a small flask. Another was scrolling through the patrol car's computer logs. "Judge Carter." Commissioner Wallace stood before her, his expression grave. "On behalf of the department, I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight." Monica studied his face, seeing genuine remorse but also sensing an opportunity. "Commissioner, what happened tonight isn't about one bad officer. It's about a system that enabled him." She gestured toward Officer Diaz, who stood nearby. "It's also about good officers who are put in impossible positions when they witness misconduct." The commissioner nodded slowly. "The oversight committee you've established, we need to discuss expanding its powers." "Tonight proves why," Monica said firmly. "I want a complete audit of every traffic stop Officer Kincaid has conducted in the past 5 years. Every complaint filed against him. Every case where evidence might have been tampered with." Wallace looked uncomfortable but nodded. "It will be done." An internal affairs officer approached, his expression grim. "Sir, you need to see this." He held up Kincaid's phone. Text messages between Kincaid and Detective Sanderson from earlier today. The commissioner read the messages, his face darkening. He looked up at Monica. "They specifically mentioned your route home. This wasn't random." "I suspected as much," Monica said quietly. "How deep does this go, Commissioner?" "We'll find out," he promised, "no matter where it leads." The next morning, Judge Monica Carter sat in her chambers, watching the news on her tablet. Her encounter had made headlines. "Federal judge confronts corrupt officer. Body camera footage reveals racial profiling and conspiracy." The footage from Officer Diaz's camera had been released, showing the entire confrontation. Public reaction was swift and powerful. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters. Civil rights leaders called for a complete department overhaul. What surprised Monica most was the number of officers coming forward with their own stories. Good cops who had witnessed misconduct but felt powerless to stop it. The blue wall of silence was beginning to crack. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded. Kincaid's phone records revealed connections to 6 other officers, all part of the corruption ring she had ruled against. His search history showed a pattern of stalking her movements, learning her schedule. Most damning were the records of his previous traffic stops, 81% targeting minority drivers, with little to no legitimate cause documented. Dozens of victims came forward, many with stories eerily similar to Monica's own experience. Kincaid was denied bail, deemed both a flight risk and a threat to witnesses. His former colleagues divided into camps, those demanding accountability and those closing ranks to protect their own. The department's deep-seated problems were exposed for all to see. 1 year later, Judge Monica Carter stood at a podium in the newly established police training academy. Behind her hung a large sign. "The Carter Standards, Equality under the Law." The room was filled with fresh-faced cadets, their expressions earnest and attentive. At the side of the stage stood Officer, now Sergeant, Rachel Diaz, recently appointed head of the Academy's Ethics and Accountability Division. "A year ago tonight," Monica began, "I was pulled over for what many call driving while black." Her voice carried throughout the silent room. What could have ended in tragedy instead became a catalyst for change. She gestured to the wall where statistics were displayed. 72% reduction in unauthorized stops, 94% compliance with body camera regulations, 37 officers removed for misconduct, $14 million in restitution to victims of police abuses. "The badge is not a shield from accountability, but a symbol of the highest responsibility," she continued. "Every person you encounter deserves the same respect, the same rights, regardless of their skin color or economic status." In the back of her mind, Monica could still see Kincaid's face as the judge had read his sentence. 15 years for conspiracy, civil rights violations, and attempted assault. His former partners had received similar sentences. The corruption ring had been dismantled, root and branch. But prosecution alone wasn't enough. Real change required rebuilding. After the lecture, Monica met with a group of black law students she mentored, bright young minds who no longer saw the system as their enemy, but as an instrument they could help reshape. "How do you handle the pressure?" one young woman asked. "Knowing that your actions that night changed so much?" Monica smiled. "I remember something my mother told me. Justice isn't just a concept in law books. It's what you do when no one is watching, and what you refuse to accept when everyone is watching." Later that evening, Monica drove home along the same route where Kincaid had stopped her a year before. The same streets, the same car, but everything else had changed. As she turned into her neighborhood, she noticed a patrol car parked nearby. The officer inside nodded respectfully as she passed. Not out of fear or special treatment, but out of the basic respect every citizen deserves. At a conference the following week, Monica delivered the keynote address to a packed auditorium of judges, officers, and community leaders. "Justice is often portrayed as blind," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But justice must never be silent. It must speak out when rights are violated. It must act when power is abused." She paused, looking out over the diverse faces before her. Change doesn't come from one night, one case, or one judge. It comes when we all refuse to accept the unacceptable. When good people, whether they wear robes, badges, or simply the mantle of citizenship, find the courage to stand up and say, "No more." As she concluded her speech, Monica thought of her children, of the world they were inheriting, still imperfect, still struggling with the legacy of racism, but perhaps a little more just than before. The path forward requires courage from everyone. The courage to acknowledge wrongs, the courage to protect rights, the courage to hold even ourselves accountable. She stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause, knowing that the work was far from finished. But for the first time in her long career, Monica Carter felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Because sometimes justice isn't just about the law. Sometimes it's about standing your ground. Sometimes it's about taking back power from those who abuse it. And sometimes it's about one person who refuses to be the next victim of a broken system. Stand firm, speak up, and remember that justice isn't just blind. It watches, it listens, and when necessary, it takes a badge from unworthy hands.